Professor Stone, pundits speculate that Russia waited till the end of the Beijing Olympics before it takes bolder actions against Ukraine because Mr. Putin didn't want to upstage Mr. Xi or steal sort of his Olympic moment. This raises an interesting historical question for me. In its history, has Russia enjoyed true alliances with other nations? And I'm very cautious about the word alliance because the way I read history, the Warsaw Pact was more of sort of an agreement between vassal states to come and aid Soviet Union in case of a military conflict. It wasn't a true alliance in that sense of sort of equal partners.
So certainly there have been examples. Probably the best example of a real alliance of equals would be in the era before World War I. In the couple decades before World War I, both France and Russia saw themselves as under increasing pressure from Germany. Under the ancient principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, both France and Russia naturally saw each other as allies against Germany. And so France and Russia at the beginning of the 1890s signed a series of agreements that made them allies, even though their political systems were quite different. France was, relatively speaking, politically radical. Russia was probably the most conservative power in Europe at that point. So ideologically, they had very little in common, except this concrete opposition to German expansion. And that alliance brought Russia and France into World War I on the same side, and the British joined in as well. So Russia does have a history of being in alliances. But I think you're correct that it's not a fundamental principle of Russian security. Russia is not tended to look at alliances as the way that it seeks to organize its own security. Whereas the United States really does. The United States has alliances with sort of NATO, with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia. The United States has alliances all over the place. And it's the way that we think about collective security. And the Russians don't tend to do that very much. And likewise, China. China has one treaty ally, and that's North Korea. China does have close relationships with a number of other states, Pakistan, for example, but it has one ally, and that's North Korea. Now, certainly Russia and China have been cooperating very actively in recent years. And there are things that bring them together. For example, Russia produces lots of energy. China needs lots of energy. And so there's an economic connection. The fundamental connection, though, is that, as I read it, both Moscow and Beijing share a common sense that the United States stands in the way of the way they would like to see the world work, which involves this sort of great powers dominate their neighborhoods and tell their neighbors what to do. And they see the US and kind of the Western world more generally as an obstacle to that, as kind of blocking that path. And so, to my mind, the Russia-China relationship is, to a large degree, an alliance of convenience in opposition to the United States. Now, Putin and Xi Jinping have clearly established a personal relationship. There is, it seems, real warmth between them. But fundamentally, it's about opposition to the US. And what's interesting is that there's a fair amount of history that has been suppressed by that. Much of the Russian Far East today used to be Chinese territory. And it was Chinese territory that it was taken away by the Russians by the use of force or the threat of force. When China was in its century of humiliation, when China was falling apart at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. In the 1800s, Russia took and annexed large chunks of Chinese territory. And the People's Republic of China in the past has tended to be fairly touchy about territory that it sees as rightfully belonging to China. That issue has been set aside. And again, the question is, how long? Is that an issue that's permanently been resolved, or is that something that might rear its head in the future? Impossible to say.
Do you see a future China-Russian alliance of some sort, military alliance?
You certainly couldn't rule it out. There's a great deal of military cooperation in terms of arms sales and joint exercises. But normally when we say an alliance, we mean something a little bigger. And that would be that in a defensive alliance would be if China is attacked, Russia would come to China's aid. If Russia is attacked, China would come to Russia's aid. again, I think the chances of NATO attacking Russia are really, really tiny, essentially
Yeah.
non-existent. The more ominous question would be an offensive alliance. The issue there, though, is that Russia's key priorities are not Beijing's key priorities. Moscow has things that it cares a lot about, but it doesn't tend to be the things that Beijing cares a lot about. Beijing cares an awful lot about Taiwan.
Yeah.
Cares an awful lot about the states on its immediate borders. Russia cares about things. It cares about the Middle East. It cares what happens in Eastern Europe. But those are not necessarily the things that occupy the Chinese. And so there is certainly a great deal of cooperation. It could certainly get deeper, but the fundamental things that the two governments are concerned about kind of head in different directions, for lack of a better term.
If you wanted our audience to remember just one point about war in Ukraine after everything we've talked about, what would it be?
So it would be to respect the idea that Ukraine is a real country, that Putin is consistently trying to portray Ukraine as a puppet of the West, as kind of Russians who just don't quite understand that they belong with Russia. But it's that Ukraine is a real country, and it's been a real country for 30 years, and Ukrainians have a sense of themselves as their own people and not as Russians. And it's worth bearing that in mind.
Your reference to the 1654 treaty is really informative. That's something that really is a point in which you realize that Ukraine is truly a different country going back several hundred years ago. Professor Stone, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners. You're welcome back to the Peel.News anytime. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective.
Adele, it's been a real pleasure. I'm delighted to talk to you, and I hope to be back again someday.
Look forward to it. Thank you so much.